Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on the last night on the Titanic. We are looking at the cast of characters that made up the fateful night for when the ship went down. Joined as always by my co-host on the series, Veronica Hinkey. Veronica, how are you?
Hi, Scott. I'm well and looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, I mean, we set the things up in our previous episode where we introduced what the series was going to be about and trying to get out of the simple narrative that most people would know about the Titanic, probably because they just saw the movie in 97 and just think about things in terms of first, second, and third class. But there's way more to it. And the first person we're going to look at is Charles Joughin, who is a baker, but he happened to make his way into the different film accounts of the Titanic. So maybe that's a good place to start. Who is Charles Joughin and how was he represented in the two film versions about the Titanic?
Well, Scott, like you point out, so much of what we've seen and heard about the Titanic is those many faces. And who were those people? Like Charles, for instance, he was the head baker aboard the Titanic. We see him in those comic relief type scenes where he's the baker with the baker's cap on and he's hanging on to the railings as people are running up the poop deck at the very end before the Titanic sinks. And, it's meant in Hollywood speak to be sort of a comic relief moment, but it's actually a story about a very, very unfortunate man, but he survived in the end. And his story is incredible.
He was one of the first people to see the iceberg. Is that correct?
Well, he saw the iceberg and he told his nieces and nephews about it after he survived. And it was one of the ways that he masked the horrors of the night that he went through. He didn't talk about any of the bad things, but he talked about seeing that iceberg. And he told his family, I knew it was an iceberg when I saw it because I saw a polar bear and he waved at me.
How does he show up in the two movies? I haven't seen A Night to Remember. Is there actually a scene of him seeing a polar bear, or how does he show up in these works of The Night to Remember and then the James Cameron Titanic film?
Well, the polar bear sighting is a story from one of his family members. His great niece, who's in New Jersey, shared that with me. And it was one of the dear memories that she holds close about her great uncle. And in the movie, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, the scene is where Charles and others are running up the poop deck, Jack and Rose, the two main characters of the movie, and they're desperately trying to stay away from the water as long as they can. The water, of course, was somewhere around 28 degrees that night. So the whole intent was to get as high up as they could as the Titanic pointed north and started to descend underneath. And in that scene, we see Charles running with the group, hundreds of people. And that actually happened, Scott. He told the officers during the British inquiry after the Titanic that he was taking a break. He was drinking a glass of water in a little galley that he found. And as he was drinking a glass of water, he noticed, just like the scene in the James Cameron movie, he noticed these people rushing the deck, just the poop deck. And that is when he tells his story about how he became part of this group and was within moments in the water. He said that his life vest was so effective. It was filled with cork, and it helped him so much that he said that his hair never even got wet.
Another thing too from the movies is that he's does he have a whiskey flask? Is it he's drinking? Is that right?
Yeah, in the movie you see him with a whiskey flask. And the folklore that's been heavily attached to this over the years has always been, the belief has always been that Charles was drinking whiskey. And in talking with his family members, we learned that he was not drinking whiskey that night. He told the British inquiry officials that he was drinking, but he told his family that it was schnapps, in fact, not whiskey. And Scott, back in those days, it was not uncommon in the staff quarters, the crew quarters, where the bunks were, where they slept, to find jerry-rigged stills for where they made whiskey, brandy, all sorts of different things. And Charles, being the head baker, would have more than likely had plenty of access to wheat for making whiskey, fruit and yeast for making all kinds of different things like schnapps, brandy. So it's not uncommon at all to think that that was the case. And what's more is the heart-wrenching story that I found in my research as to why he started drinking that night. And that story is just very inspiring.
Yeah, so let's get into his background. For Charles Joughin, had he only started working at sea in the last few years, or was this something that he had been doing throughout his life?
So Charles was 33 when he was aboard the Titanic, and so by no means was this a new. As we look at all the different people in the book, there are examples of people who are new to working on a ship, some that had been involved in working on a ship a little bit. Charles was one of the veterans. He began working at sea as a child. He was a child laborer, and he knew very well the lifestyle of how people would live in towns like Southampton, where he boarded the Titanic, and he lived with his 2 babies and his wife. And being in Southampton at that time was sort of on a par with Queens, New York, where there are tons and several apartment buildings where there are crew members of airlines, where they share apartments, sometimes 20, 25 to an apartment in bunks. Southampton was like that in those days. And when I spoke with Charles's great niece, she mentioned how when the Titanic went down, she made the point that an entire town went with it, and that town was Southampton. And that is because so many of the crew, like Charles did, would live there and spend a couple months with their families. Sometimes they wouldn't be actually living there year round, but they'd just live there for a few months and try to, catch their next gig on the sea. And when the Titanic was getting ready to sail, there was a coal strike on. So it was very difficult to get work then. However, Charles was one of the people who was able to get work, as were many of the staff of the Titanic, because they had previously worked on the sister ship of the Titanic, which was the Olympic. So Charles, found this opportunity, and it was an incredible honor, and back then, for the people that got those jobs, to be aboard this majestic ship, the Titanic. It was the biggest and the most glamorous of its time ever before. It was intended to set records beyond belief, and any crew member on board, including Charles, would have been very grateful for the opportunity.
And was he always working as a baker when he had these roles on these different ships?
No, actually, he worked up through the years. His story is an incredible one of working hard and being promoted. And in addition to working in baking capacities, he also worked in all sorts of different capacities. I'm sure whatever he could find, pretty much, whether it be, working as a kitchen aide, supporting other chefs and bakers, and that sort of thing. Charles was actually trained, as he had time off from his jobs at sea. He was trained to be a fine pastry chef. So he delighted in making things like beautiful chocolate eclairs and Napoleons. He was known for making, and lovely, beautiful christening cakes. His great niece was excited to tell me about a beautiful christening cake that he made with hand-blown sugar that he made for the top. The sugar formed a cradle, and the family kept it forever. And one of the reasons we chose chocolate eclairs for this section of the book, a recipe by Gail Gand, is because Charles loved to make chocolate eclairs for his family. So recipes like that are interspersed throughout the book. It's a culinary narrative, of course, so we have recipes that are dedicated to people. And in this case, we wanted to dedicate something very special to Charles in honor of his history as a fine pastry chef.
Well, let's get to the big moment after the Titanic strikes the iceberg on Sunday night, April 14th at 11:40. And this is when things kick into high gear. So where is Charles and what happens with him?
You're right. This is when things kick into really high gear. And this is when Charles is faced with some of the most trying moments of his life. At 11:40, when the Titanic struck the iceberg, Charles was in his bunk. He was reading, and he was startled, like so many passengers and crew were, at 11:40 that night. It was a Sunday night, and he and his crew were sort of, kicking back, getting ready to go to bed for getting up in the morning for another hard day at sea. The days were long and hard, and they were resting when they could. He got up and went and found out what was going on when he saw that they were loading lifeboats. Having been a veteran crew at sea, he knew to look to his checklist. Okay, what do I need to do? He asked himself when they're loading lifeboats. The first thing on my checklist is, or one of the first things is, I need to load bread loaves into the lifeboats. So he's set to task, shaking up his crew, getting them awake, and sending them up with loaves of bread. There were also bickies in the lifeboats, or biscuits. They were nicknamed bickies, and they were made of just a real basic mix of flour, salt, and some baking powder. And there are recipes for bickies in the book. And the bickies were standard staple on lifeboats for sustenance. So those two things were in at least for sure some of the lifeboats. Then Charles went, after the lifeboats were loaded with bread and bickies, he went up to start helping load the lifeboats. And at this point, he is seeing that, some of the women are reluctant to board the lifeboats. You would have to jump sometimes several levels to get into a boat. A lot of people thought they would be safer on the ship than in a lifeboat. So there was, a lot of hesitation on the part of the passengers to board. So he helps board lifeboats. And when he gets to lifeboat 10, which is his assigned lifeboat, he helps board it. It becomes completely boarded. And, I mentioned a little bit earlier about why he was drinking that night. And I think everyone can understand when I tell you this story why. When it came time for the lifeboat to be staffed, the officers in charge of staffing the boat did not give Charles the command to board lifeboat 10 and to command it. They gave the orders to 3 other staff, and those crew members boarded, and they went out on lifeboat 10. And, Charles went and continued to help where he could. And he told the British inquiry officials that was when he went back down to his bunk for, as he put it, so he went down to his bunk and had a drink and came back up a little while later. And he noticed that all the lifeboats were gone at this point. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
No lifeboats left on the Titanic. Yeah. And just thinking of that kind of feeling, I myself, this story was so emotional for me to learn about and to tell and to have that responsibility of telling it well. And I said to a friend of mine at the time, this is just really a hard year for me to do this because my mother had just passed away unexpectedly. She had recently gotten married to someone after my father passed away.